Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to present here today Professor Dr. Richard Shavelson, Emeritus Professor of Stanford University School of Education in California, here as a keynote speaker at our meeting here in Paderborn. And Mr. Shavelson, he's a scientist, chief scientist at Asker Partners, and Emeritus Margaret Jack Professor of Education. And he also served in the last few years as president of the American Educational Research Association just a few years ago, with his broad range of research interests, from psychometrics to assessments over to self-regulation, curricular design, or instructional designs, it's just quite an interesting part to hear him today with his talk about assessing college learning and collegiate learning assessments. And the stage is up to you. Thank you for being here. Welcome here in Paderborn. Thanks, Mr. Shavelson.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for being here. And I especially want to thank Esther Winter and Dagmar Festner for taking very good care of me. And I think that the other thing I'd like to do is say that the staff of the conference has done a spectacular job. I can't imagine. It's like taking cats and trying to get them to go in one direction or another direction. And they've done a spectacular job, so I want to thank you very much for a wonderful conference. Yeah. I've been asked to talk to you today about assessment, and I kind of feel like a lone person here talking about assessment after all that I've heard. And in particular, I've been asked to talk about the Collegiate Learning Assessment. I think what we call the CLA is arguably a very innovative way of assessing college learning. It's different from all of the other measures that we have. And I think you'll see that difference as I proceed. I also think you'll see parallels between what I have to present today in assessment and the kinds of things that Stephen Billett was talking about in his speech yesterday. Stephen distinguished formal education from, with its focus on declarative and procedural knowledge, with workforce learning, in which the role of tacit knowledge, observation, and actual performance is the most important thing to be looking at. So that's the kind of thing I want to talk about today. And in the talk, I want to talk a little bit about competence measurement. And you'll see that as I define competence measurement, I think about it a little bit differently than is traditionally thought about today, both in Europe and in the United States, where learning progressions, item response theory, and those conceptions hold sway in the development of competence measures. So I'll do it a little bit differently. Then I want to talk in particular about the Collegiate Learning Assessment, which follows from a different kind of competence model, the one that I'll present today, and talk about its conceptual underpinnings, the task and response construction for the assessment, how it's scored, how it's administered, examples of the kinds of tasks that are on the CLA, and finally I'll present some statistical and qualitative evidence about the quality of the measure. If I have time, I will then briefly talk about a CLA type of approach to measuring business planning, to give you an idea how it might be applied to the field that you're particularly interested in. So I'll proceed. I think the challenge was well stated by Hartig, Klima and Leutner. The theoretical modeling of competencies, their assessment and the usage of assessment results in practice present new challenges for psychological and educational research. And that is indeed the case. When I think about the construct of competence, I try to think about, well, if I'm going to measure it, maybe I ought to know something about it. And I think Harding's definition captures the essence of what I think about as competence, that it's a complex ability that's closely related to real-life situations. So I want to unpack that. I want to pull it apart and see what it means. First of all, competence deals with complexity. That is, the world presents itself and the kinds of activities that we engage in everyday situations are complex. They're not simple. The focus is on doing, not just knowing. That is, performing, being able to actually do something in life situations, take action. In the context of measurement, it means that when we look and try to judge the competence of a financier, let's say, we want to make sure that we have them performing the same or very similar tasks as one another on the assessment. You don't want to compare apples and oranges. You want consistency in what you're observing. There's this notion of fidelity. That is, what's on the assessment really ought to be taken from the life situations in which you want to know how they perform. It shouldn't be some abstracted, short little thing. It should be something that's drawn from a job, drawn from an educational experience of something like that. That is, should be high fidelity. The notion of competence also implies the idea of some level of performance. That is, we say that person is competent, that person isn't competent. And it implies that there's some level of performance at which we're going to say, if the person performs at this level, we'll call that person competent. Otherwise, we'll call that person less than competent. The notion of competence is different, say, than aptitude in the sense that we believe that you can improve your performance on the kinds of activities that we're interested in. So ingrained in that is the notion that with practice, with education, with effort, a person can continually improve and improve to the level where we will call that person competent and beyond that level. And finally, it implies certain dispositions that you'd expect in people. That is, the identification of the individual with the domain that the person's working in. That this is part of my life, this is part of me, I engage in this. The intent to improve performance continuously. I'm not satisfied with how well I'm doing now, but I want to improve. Self-regulation, the capacity to regulate your performance, to observe your performance, and inform that performance. It seems to me that these are the kinds of things that underlie the notion of competence. And that any measure of competence needs to be able to take into consideration these kinds of dimensions. So if I put it all together, I'd say a competence measure should tap complex physical and/or intellectual skills, produce observable performance on a common standardized set of tasks, with high fidelity to the performances observed in the real world situations to which inferences of competence are to be drawn, with scores reflecting the level of performance, mastery or continuous, on tasks where improvement can be made through dispositions for learning and deliberative practice. So that, in a long sentence, is what I think a measure of competence should involve. With that definition, we're in a situation now to begin to define a measurement. That is, the definition of competence talks about the boundaries in which you will select tasks to observe a person's performance, on the basis of which you're going to infer whether he or she is competent in a domain. That is, you're going to draw tasks, you're going to draw responses to those tasks. And when I say responses to the tasks, if you think about some performance, like driving a car or riding a bicycle, not only do I want to observe the task of riding a bicycle, but I want to see how that person responds to the bicycle or responds to various situations. And I want to capture the response as it occurs in the real world, not on a multiple choice test that says what the person would do. So that's the distinction I want to draw, that this definition sets certain conditions for what will count as tasks and responses on a test. The tasks, the responses, the people who score performance, the various methods of eliciting performance, and all of the like are sampled, or they're drawn from this competence domain. So I think of an assessment as consisting of a set of tasks and responses and scoring methods that are drawn from this competence domain. And of course, you can only draw so many tasks because you only have so much time. So in any assessment, we're sampling behavior. We're not getting the whole universe of behavior in that domain. And we're always in a position of trying to infer from what we observe to what must be true of performance of competence in the domain. We set standards for what level of performance we think competence would be. And if we assume that the tasks are sampled from this domain of competence, then we can use statistical theories like generalizability theory to model the data. And in addition, we can get qualitative indicators of the validity of those measures and the interpretation of them by looking at content validity, that are the tasks, the kinds of tasks that people perform in real life situations, as well as cognitive validity. That is, when people engage in the tasks, are they doing the kind of thinking that we expect them to do in the real world when they actually perform those tasks? So this whole model then, from the notion of competence, comes down to actually a model in which you specify the nature of the tasks on the assessment, you sample those tasks, you look at performance, and you draw inferences based on some statistical and qualitative modeling of that performance. So let me turn to the Collegiate Learning Assessment and use that as a concrete example of what I'm talking about. The Collegiate Learning Assessment is intended to measure critical thinking, analytic reasoning, problem solving, communication in real-life situations. The CLA is the assessment of generic skills that's being used in the AHELO project of OECD, that is the assessment of higher education learning outcomes. It's intended to measure generic reasoning and problem solving in everyday life. Reasoning about articles in a newspaper you might read in science, or reviews of a book in humanities, the capacity to engage civically in various events. That is, it looks at life experiences, samples those life experiences, and looks at the problem solving and the critical thinking capacities of college students. In my presentation, I'll talk just about performance tasks. I don't have time to go into the writing task, but if you're interested, I can lead you there. And now let me talk about the approach that's taken with the CLA and within the competence framework that I've talked about. It's oftentimes called Criterion Sampling. McClellan wrote a famous article in 1972 in the American Psychologist saying you should measure competence, not intelligence. And some of what he meant is in this. The Criterion Sampling approach says if you want to know, for example, whether a person can drive a car, don't give the person just a multiple choice test. You probably want to do something more. What you'd like to do is sample driving situations. Can the person start a car? Can the person pull out in traffic? Can the person park the car? Can the person make a left turn, a right turn? Can the person stop the car? That's a good thing to do too. That is, you want to observe performances on a sample of real-life situations because you want to infer from the driver's test whether the person's capable of driving the car in the real world. So that's the kind of notion, that you sample tasks from the real-world situations you're interested in. The responses are not just selected responses like multiple choice items. That's fine for knowledge of the driver's laws. But they're actually operant responses. That is, you operate on the real world by responding to it and adjusting your responses to the feedback that you get while you're driving or while you're doing any other tasks. The intent is to elicit complex thinking. Most of the time in the real world, we don't do simple thinking. The world doesn't come to us in a multiple choice question that says, choose A, B, C, or D, and there's only one correct answer. There's usually multiple correct answers, some better answers than other answers, and it's complicated. And we want our assessment to do that. And then the interesting part is that if you actually sample tasks from the real world and you teach people to perform those tasks, that is, you teach them to perform well on the test, doing that isn't cheating. That's not wrong, that's good. Because if they can improve on the test tasks, it must mean they can improve on the tasks in the domain that you're interested in. And the Collegiate Learning Assessment follows along those lines. I want to contrast this with what many of us are used to, which is the psychometric approach. And in that case, what you do is you take a complex task, you divide it into micro tasks, miniature tasks, pieces of those things that are unidimensional, and you form unidimensional scales on that. So you take complex performance, divide it into its underlying subtasks, you find unidimensional scales, and you measure that. The focus is on respondent responses. In particular, 0, 1 is good, right or wrong. And we can certainly use graded scales and other things, but the intent is to give multiple questions that yield 0, 1 answers to these narrowly defined basic skills. The intent in this, actually underlying it, is to get at students fast thinking. That is, you give them 30 or 40 multiple choice questions, each with 30 seconds to respond to. And that's what I call fast thinking, rather than deliberate thinking, where it takes time to integrate information and think through a complex problem. And of course, you have to maintain tight test security if it's a high-stakes test. You can't let the test items out. So there is a big contrast, and I think the Peanuts cartoon captures this. It says Charlie Brown is thinking, and I know that Peanuts is fairly international, so I think I'm safe. He says, sometimes I lie awake at night and I ask, is life a multiple choice test or is it a true-false test? Then a voice comes to me out of the dark and says, we hate to tell you this, but life is a 1,000-word essay. Well, I think that captures what I'm trying to say, that you can't get everything in a multiple choice test or a true-false test, and that's the tack that we take in the development of the CLA and other measures. So, when we define a task, and I'll give you concrete examples in a minute, we think of drawing tasks from real-world situations. And the newspaper is a wonderful place to go. I mean, if you want to do something on ethics, just read the business pages. You'll have plenty to work with. If you want to deal with science, read the health pages, the medical pages, the science pages in a newspaper is a great source. If you want to deal with the humanities and art, they're parts of the newspaper. That's not the sole place that I get information from, certainly not, but you get the idea that everyday life we encounter these complicated situations. We need to make decisions about stem cells. That's just not a simple thing to do. And it involves a lot more than just cognition. So you get the idea, real world problem. The problem is not divided into small pieces. You present the whole complex problem all at one time. Because in life, that's the way it comes to you. You don't get it parsed out, well, answer this, then answer that, then answer that. Generally, it's complicated. It's holistic. And when we build these tasks, we know not only do we sample these tasks from real-world situations, but we construct them in such a way that we know the structure of the task and what in this case, the critical thinking demands are in the task. That is, we present information to students that may be relevant or irrelevant to doing the task. And they have to decide which pieces of information relate to the task and which are interesting but irrelevant. Secondly, some of the information we give the students is reliable and some of it's not. So that a reliable information might be a technical report written by a government agency. An unreliable piece might be an interview with some hysterical person who has just observed a crime. Distinguishing between reliable and unreliable information is critical, especially today with the internet. Finally, we know that there are judgmental heuristics that we all use to think fast. That is, correlation is not causality, but sometimes we mix it up. Those things that you can easily remember must be more frequent than those things that you can't easily remember. That is, there are a variety of heuristics, judgmental heuristics that people use in their everyday life to function, to think quickly, to react to the real world in a realistic way. And we embed potential errors in the material we give students, so they have to be very careful about paying attention to correlation and causality, paying attention to baseline situations when they make comparisons between different groups and things of that sort. So that we know when we score exactly what we're looking for to see what information the student used and what information the student didn't use in their argument to build a case and move forward. In the response format, much of our measures will have multiple choice questions, but the major pieces of it are open-ended responses. And we ask students to make a recommendation or a decision, to reach a conclusion, to solve a problem, to decide on a course of action. The prompt is minimally structured. The student's job is to structure his or her argument as to what course of action to take and what the justification is and what's the evidence for that course of action and what is the evidence against another course of action. Most of it's written, not selected responses. It requires the use of evidence, and it requires the evaluation of different possibilities. That's all built into these questions, so at the point that we begin to score, we pretty much know what information is accurate, what information is related to the problem, and where the potential challenges are for the student not to make judgmental errors. We score performance on 4 dimensions: an analytic, reasoning, and evaluation, where the students identify strengths and weaknesses of alternatives. They judge the quality of the evidence. Second dimension is problem solving, provides a decision and solid rationale based on credible evidence. Acknowledges uncertainty and the need for other information. On writing effectiveness, how well they organize the advice in logically cohesive and easy to follow way. Provides valid and comprehensive details supporting the case. In addition, we look at writing mechanics, which may not be of interest in other areas, but in our country, we do. The CLA is delivered on an internet platform, and I'm not going to go into detail with this slide. The important thing to note is that with the internet platform, we can use open-ended questions. We can get students to respond on computers, and therefore we have electronic files. We can then use the internet platform to send those files to people to rate the performance, judges to rate the performance of students. We can also use the computer technology to have the computer evaluate student performance as well. In fact, this is the major breakthrough that allows us to use these open-ended tasks where in the past we couldn't do it. Because what we find is that we can use computers to score complex performance on detailed essays that students write and do so accurately. And therefore, right now we're testing hundreds of thousands of students in the spring and the fall every year in the United States and other parts of the world with this test because the computer can score performance. It allows us to do matrix sampling so that the response burden isn't tremendous on any one student, but we're able to estimate the performance of a college or a university or some academic program. And once we have electronic files, it makes reporting a lot easier and quicker. So let me give you a task. You're a student, you sit down at the assessment, and this is what you're told about. By the way, this particular task came from a newspaper article that I was reading, and there was a aircraft accident at a local airport, and it got me to thinking about this. It says, you're an assistant to Pat Williams, the president of Dynatech, a company that makes precision electronic instruments and navigational equipment. Sally Evans, a member of the Dynatech sales force, recommended that Dynatech buy a small private plane that she and other members of the sales force could use to visit customers. Pat was about to approve the purchase when there was an accident involving Swift Air 235. You're provided with the following documentation. You're given newspaper articles about the accident. You're given a Federal Aviation accident report on the in-flight breakup of single-engine planes. You get Pat's email to you and Sally's email to Pat. You get all the email background. You get charts on the Swift Air's performance and characteristics. You get an amateur pilot's article comparing Swift Air to similar airplanes. And finally, you get pictures and descriptions of the different models of Swift Air. And then you're asked, please prepare a memo that addresses several questions, including what data support or refute the claim that the type of wing on the Swift Air leads to more in-flight breakups. What other factors might contribute to the accident, and should these be taken into account? And what is your overall recommendation about whether or not Dynatech should purchase the plane? So that's the task that you're set, and you're asked to respond to the task. This will give you some idea of the information in the documents the students get. And if you look at, will that work? No. I'll stay away from that. If you look over here, you have a chart, and you look at this chart includes all types of accidents in flight and on the ground that resulted in injury and so on and so forth. And this is the Swift Air. Oh, that one. Yeah, that's what I tried. Oh, okay. This is about the Swift Air. And what you see here is, it doesn't take a genius to figure out it's increasing, the number of accidents are increasing. And especially here, something must have happened where they introduced a new plane. So this is from somebody saying, Pat, the president, I plotted some data I found on the FAA's website. It appears that there was a significant increase in the number of Swift Air accidents after the company switched from the strut brace wing to the cantilevered wing. And here you have evidence that, wow, there's something wrong. You convinced? Well, take a look over here. This also, now notice that this is 2001, 2002. Let's take a look over here. This is the Swift Air 235 accident. But this also gives the data on the sales. This is the accidents, here are sales. look what happens. In 2001, the sales start to skyrocket, where the sales of the competitors go down. So that if you looked at the accident rate, you have to take into account how many planes were in the air. And what you find proportionally is that the accident rates are less for the Swiftair 235 than they are for the other aircraft. It's that kind of reasoning, by not taking into account the baseline information you have, when you make some decisions based only on this data. So that's the kind of reasoning that we build into the test. Now, people challenge me and they say, that's awfully quantitative. And I admit to that. But believe me, there's plenty of qualitative similar arguments that we put in here. But I wanted to give you an idea. This is a judgmental heuristic when people don't pay attention to baseline and they make decisions simply the way Harrison did, saying we have a big problem here. Yeah, it's a problem, but it's not as big as you think it is. So that gives you an idea of the kind of tasks that we have on the test. I want to present some evidence then of the reliability and validity of the test. And I'll do that, and I'll skip through some of it. The point here is we asked faculty who had taken the CLA what they thought of the tasks on the test. And they were pretty happy. They thought they were important tasks. They would intend to teach things like that. They thought they probably would predict real-life situations and whether kids would get ahead and would distinguish kids that really understood something and could think critically and couldn't. But they said that they don't teach them very often in this way. And in fact, we now have faculty academies where we work with faculty to build these types of tasks because they want these tasks for their classrooms, whether it's biology or psychology or literature. They're interested in these complex tasks and they want to go ahead and learn how to do it. There's a website where they share these tasks, they use the tasks, and they build and improve upon the tasks so that these are getting integrated into the teaching because of the recognition that they weren't doing this in their classrooms. Some people say, well, is the test biased? That is, what I showed you was a very science-like or an engineering-like question. Well, it turns out that we have questions on the CLA that are very much science technology, very much social science, and also in the humanities. And is there an unfair bias from one to the other? And what surprised me was, first of all, this is the performance after adjusting for the SAT, which is our college admissions test, is that the social scientists seem to be doing better regardless of whether it's a science task, a social science, or humanities task than the others. So on a science and engineering task, these are the scientists and engineers. On a social science task, they do really well. And here's on the humanities, the yellow. So it looks like there are some differences. Social scientists tend to perform rather well on the test. And scientists do better on science tasks. Humanities people do better on humanities tasks. This accounts for maybe 1 to 2% of the variance in scores. So it tends it tends not to be all that big a deal. When we look at reliability of the test, we find that we get high inter-rater consistency. We get high correlations between machine-scored and human-scored essays. And I'll show you more data on that. And we continually monitor both the human scores and the machine to make sure they stay calibrated. We do some other, a bit fancier stuff with value-added scoring. At the institutional level, what we do is we take the scores for each college. We randomly divide students in half. You with me? And then we look at the correlation between one half of the students and the other half of the students across these institutions. It's kind of an internal consistency coefficient or a split half coefficient at the institution level. So that if we get reliable measures for each college, then the correlation between one half of the students and the other half should be really high across all of the colleges. And that's what we find. And we also find that the value-added scores are adequately reliable over 0.7, as I recall. And here's what I think is really quite interesting, because people are concerned that we use computers to score performance. And these are each of the areas, and this is problem solving, so that analytical reasoning and evaluation, this is one of the criteria, the second dimension. This is writing mechanics. This is the correlation between two humans on average. This is the correlation between the computer and a human on average. And here's the overall 0.86, 0.92, and so on. So what we find is that the computer can reliably evaluate performance. We also send papers through where we try to fake it so that it's not a real answer, and see whether the computer will throw out the paper to just challenge to make sure the computer is not scoring things high that have no meaning to them. And the computer is reasonably accurate in throwing those papers out. If the computer gets a paper that it feels is strange, the computer will kick it out and ask a human to score it. It won't try to score it. So that's kind of encouraging. When we look at the reliability of performance on these tasks, we use a different theory because we're interested in the nature of measurement error, not in scaling scores. We do that later on. So this is the way we look at reliability. We say that we have a set of schools, and we're trying to distinguish schools in terms of the performance of their students. So the object of measurement is school performance at a college. And we compare different colleges. And we're interested because some college will produce more critical thinking than other colleges. We have tasks, and the tasks vary in difficulty. Some are easier, some are hard. Some are easier for some people, some tasks are easier for other people. And we have judges. We have human judges or machines, but in this case we're looking at human judges, and human judges can disagree. So that task sampling variability and judge sampling variability gives rise to measurement error. We can think of schools by task. I don't know what. Thanks. Maybe that's better. So, some schools perform well on the technical tasks. Some schools perform well on the humanitarian task. Likewise, there might be an interaction between judges in schools. Some judges like the writing of kids in one college, another college, and so on. So we're able to estimate how much variability or error is introduced into the measurement by task sampling and judge sampling. And we're interested in consistent estimates of the performance of each of these college institutions. And what you see is there's a substantial, in classical test theory, you'd call this true score variance. Tasks introduce not much, because what we do is we actually standardize the tasks so they have the same means, so it doesn't introduce differences in difficulty. Judges, very little variability. The school by task is large. The judge by school is small. The task by judge is small. And then the residual, the error, is larger down here. We get a reliability of 0.80. And what this says is we probably need to sample more tasks than we are right now on the test to improve reliability if we wanted to. Because that's the major source of error, is this interaction between the institution and the particular tasks that are on the test. Some institutions are technical, some are otherwise. So we have pretty good evidence of the reliability of the measure. There's substantial validity evidence. I'm going to jump through this. It turns out that the CLA correlates, as one would expect, with the SAT, which is our college admissions test in the United States. That is, freshmen who take the CLA their scores correlate pretty high with their SAT scores. And we look at it both for individual students, correlations are on that order, and also at the college level, which is aggregating over hundreds of students, we get a very high correlation with the SAT score. We find that the CLA is not highly correlated with overall total grade point average. There is no gender difference on the CLA. There's no average differences between genders. And the CLA scores do not correlate very highly with the National Survey of Student Engagement. This is a self-report measure of students' performance in college. And what we find is that self-reports of performance are not nearly as accurate as actual performance that you can observe. And this just came out this year, and I kind of got a kick out of it. So what Roska and Aram did was to take the top quartile on the CLA, top quartile scores, and the bottom quartile scores, so top and bottom fourth, and they looked at life outcomes. That is, the high scores on the CLA and the low scores. That is, would the CLA predict life outcomes? And it's kind of interesting. You can see here whether the people met, this is marriage, so did this couple meet at college? 19% from the top quartile, 11% from the bottom quartile. So depending on where you stand, you're more likely, if you're doing well in the CLA, to find the love of your life. It's not bad, you know. What else do you have that can predict something like that? Here, what's the chance of being married? 19% versus 11%. Chance of reading a newspaper, 81% versus 67%. Engaged civically, 72-53. Chance you're unemployed, 3.1, 9.6. Chance you have credit card debt, 37%, 51%. And are living at home, well, I'm not sure what to make out of these, but they seem to be in the right direction. If you're trying to predict life outcomes, that's not bad. Okay. So let me just turn briefly now, and then I'll end, to talk about how you might take the CLA approach and apply it to, in this case, business planning competence. As I understand in business planning, there are a number of different areas that have to be taken into account in a business plan. And I've listed those: product and services, idea, market and competition, sales and marketing, public relations, business model and organization, and financial planning. So those are the domains from which you might want to sample real-world tasks that people have to engage in if they actually were building a business plan. And so working with students with Susanna Weber, who were doing some of this, here's one of the tasks that they came up with, and I kind of stole it from them and tried to give an example. So you're planning a startup in the fashion industry. You have to decide on a supplier for textiles. Your criteria are low price and high reliability. You have narrowed the choice to 2 suppliers. Given the following information, choose one supplier and provide reliable, valid evidence for this choice against the alternative. Are you ready? Here you go. Here's your document library. And I'll let you just look through it. This is offer from supplier 1. This is the competitor, supplier 2. You're getting organic flannel, top quality, first choice. You get the price, and so on and so forth. It's complicated. There's no clear indicator. You get an email from Uncle John. Now, Uncle John's been in the industry for many years. And Uncle John's retired, but he's the kind of guy that, even though he's retired, he can't retire. He's kind of running around in the industry and talking to people, and everybody tolerates him because Uncle John was really a nice guy at the time when he was a leader in the field, but now he's a kibitzer. He wanders around and talks to everybody. And Uncle John really likes supplier number 2. Uncle John just thinks he's really great. So you're given that information as well, that you have to deal with Uncle John. You're given 3 years of data on the delivery history here. And in fact, what you find out is one of the suppliers who you might like had a real hiatus in their delivery history. And then what you learn if you look in the documentation is that the reason they did was that there was a fire in the area where their warehouse was and it burned down. And it took them 3 or 4 months to get back up to their deliveries. But other than that, they'd had superior performance. And then you have some information about the financial plan. And the information you're given, some of it's reliable, like this 3-year history going back. Some of it's unreliable, like Uncle John. Some of it's valid, some of it's related to the particular problem you're working in, and some of it's not. And then judgmental heuristics are embedded in this again, where faulty mental models and things of not understanding the system of business and how that might play out, you embed that in the information that you give people. There could be errors in the spreadsheet you look at. Well, that's an idea of how one might think about building a CLA-like task to look at business planning. When you generate those tasks, then the task would be drawn from the 5 areas of business planning. And you might draw a task that cuts across just one area or cuts across 2 or 3 areas that are more complex. You'd want on the test to test for students' conceptual understanding of the important facts and concepts in business planning, in finance, in spreadsheets, and so on. And for doing that, you might want to use multiple choice questions because they're very efficient for tapping declarative and procedural knowledge. You might want to look at behaviorally procedural knowledge where you put on the assessment a spreadsheet. And a person has to manipulate that spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet or a simpler one, in some way in building a business plan. You might want to get at the person's mental model by saying, well, today this is the case that we have this pattern of sales. What if we changed some other variable in the system? How would that affect sales and how would that affect the bottom line of whether or not you have a higher profit? And you'd ask them to reason through that. Then you would give them some unique situations. But by and large, you'd ask them ultimately, not a multiple choice question, but to talk about which of the 2 suppliers would you choose? Why would you choose them? What's the evidence for choosing them? How do you justify that choice? And why did you not choose the other one? And finally, what additional information would you like to have so that you could be more confident in your decision? So that would be an adaptation of the Collegiate Learning Assessment approach to building this. You could model this with IRT. You could model it in different ways if you wanted to, but that's the idea that might show you an application to your field. I just covered that, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your nice talk. Are there any questions in the audience here? Yeah, Esther?
Rich, thank you very much for your talk. It's a question of understanding. I really like your slide, a measure of competence should. I really love this slide.
Earlier on?
Yes.
Let me see if I can find it.
That's a slide, a competence measure should, and then a long list as follows.
Yeah.
Right. I am wondering whether a specific performance task should capture all of these points from your list. Or in another way, it is maybe enough that a specific task is capturing just a selection of that points?
I think it's going to be a selection. You can't do all of that. Yeah. I mean, when you set a performance level, you don't set it on a single task. It would be on the aggregate of tasks. So that you wouldn't do that. Not all of the items, if they're a multiple choice item of declarative knowledge, you wouldn't fulfill number one.
Okay.
So that I think you have to look at the combination of the test as a whole and ask, does it do it? Any particular task could be a very simple task, but it's a piece of information. For example, what we do is when we provide the material in the document library that students read, we'll probe their understanding with multiple choice questions. We'll ask, did they even understand what they read, let alone use it to reason with? So, yeah, it wouldn't, there's no requirement, but as a whole, you would want to be able to do that.
Okay, just coming up here for another question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you very much for your enlightening presentation. You said that the evaluation was done by a computerized way. Could you specify on how that worked? I mean, how did the computer evaluate critical thinking?
Very carefully.
Very interesting for us. No, but I mean, technically, how does it work?
I know. I have to be careful because oftentimes people from literature and writing programs ask, you know, college writing improvement programs, ask me that question, how does it work? Okay, so what the students do is that they produce their answers electronically on the computer. So you have an electronic file, okay? It turns out that there were some doubts as to whether students would be comfortable doing that. And in the AHELO project, students complained when in our pilot studies we did not let them use a computer and we were doing think alouds, you know, the cognitive analysis. They complained that they had to write by hand. They wanted to use their computer. So computers aren't a problem. They produce electronic files. Okay. Those electronic files are what we score. So what we do is we take a sample of 200 or 300 files, and we have at least 2 humans score. The humans go through a lot of training. Okay, they're trained. We have humans score 200, 300, 400 files. On the basis of this, we're able to select benchmarks along the 6-point score scale on each of the dimensions. So we have papers that are 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6, okay, on each dimension. We find the reliability reasonably high, over 0.80 inter-rater reliability. We take the benchmark papers and we feed them into a computer, a parallel processing computer. And the computer learns to distinguish each of those levels of performance. Now you want to know how the computer does that. And right now the state of the art is that the computers build a model, but it's a statistical model. It's a complicated polytomous regression model of some kind because you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it's a set of a long set of variables that it's been conditioned to look for. And it finds the variables that maximize the discrimination among those score levels. Now it takes into account lexical complexity and a lot of other things that are syntactically and semantically relevant, the word choice and things of that sort. So it's not totally blind to what's going on, but I could fake it. I could probably fake it. I know enough about the program that maybe I could. And we've done that before. We've faked the ETS program, E-Rater, we faked it so bad, it was embarrassing. But in this case, we're pretty good, and the computer, if there's any uncertainty, throws the paper out, and we look at it. So it's on this basis that the computers judge and award a score. Okay. The interesting thing about the computers is that if you take the same paper and feed it to a set of judges, you'll get a different score each time. Oh, they'll be close, but it could vary. And over time, we know judges drift. They either get harder or easier in their scoring, they get tired, they get fatigued. And so when we use human judges, we're continually calibrating them. We're continuing giving our sets of judges the same paper to make sure they're on the same point in the scale. You can feed that paper into the computer over and over again, and you'll get exactly the same score. You don't have to worry about the calibration drift with the computer. And the computer is as reliable as a human score in making a judgment about the level of performance. So that's how it works. I could go into even more detail about the computer algorithms, but I don't think that you get the idea of how it works. Does that help?
So with view and time, just one more comment.
I have only a short question. In developing your tests, did you make use of IR2 modeling or did you not? And if not, why not?
It was a short question, but it's a long answer.
Okay.
No, we did not make use of IRT modeling. The reason is that, no, let me say that we could, we will in the future. So this is a whole thing about my concerns about the assumptions underlying IRT modeling, which I hinted at. But by and large, no. What we use is we take observed scores. We use classical test theory. We use generalizability theory as a way of estimating reliability and measurement error. And when we need to scale them, we scale them with a common mean and a common variance. And so we use a linear transformation for scoring. So that, no, we don't use IRT. And you can think of it, we only have 4 scores. You know? So IRT doesn't like that at all. Not only that, they're complex scores and they're not even in the same domain. Writing is not reasoning. Well, it's related, it's correlated. So that it poses all kinds of problems for multidimensional IRT models and so on and so forth. In the future, we're building these things in which the tasks are much shorter. So instead of a 90-minute task, you might be given a 45-minute task or a 30-minute task. So we're going to have multiple performance task scores, multiple writing task scores, and we will probably have a set of 15 or 20 multiple choice items. And in that case, we will use IRT scaling. And the problem is that multiple choice items, you have many of them, and they sometimes can drive and overwhelm the information that's in the performance task score. So anyway, it's a complicated thing in order to maintain balance. And the question is, do you have an IRT scaling of it? Multidimensional scaling? Do you present a profile where certain things like multiple choices, IRT scaled for declarative knowledge, but you leave the performance scores to speak for themselves without a transformation? All of it's quite complex, and it has to do with the underlying philosophy behind the test. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I've just to offer a little gift, and I hope you like chocolate and a little drink. And I'm not sure if the cup fits to the champagne, but that will work, I think.
I could drink champagne out of anything, just about.
That's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. Many thanks.